Welcome back in. Today we're going to be discussing our top 36 wide receivers for week 3. It has been a bloodbath out there in terms of injuries, but we're here to get you through it. So let's go ahead and talk about our wide receiver ones first. So let's start this off with CeeDee Lamb, Jamar Chase, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Justin Jefferson, Rashee Rice, Nico Collins, Devontae Adams, Brandon Ayuk, Marvin Harrison, Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, and Chris Godwin wrapping out our top 12. Cody, hit us with the good stuff.
Yeah, man, gonna kick it off with Jamar Chase. We saw the offense look more functional last week against KC. That still only resulted in 35 yards for Jamar Chase. But now, Kev, they get just about the best possible matchup you could ask for to get your passing game on track. Going up against the Commanders, Washington starting right where they left off last year, where they gave up the second most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Through 2 weeks, they've allowed the most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Just made Danny Dimes look not awful, which is a feat in and of itself. T. Higgins still working his way back from the hamstring injury. This is setting up as an absolute smash game for Jamar Chase. So you were finally feeling good about firing him up. Chris Godwin is on an absolute tear to start the year. Back-to-back wide receiver 1 finishes for the Penn State great. He has seen 16 targets, catching 15 of those for 200 yards and 2 scores, getting 1 in each week. Godwin has been in the slot for over 58% of his snaps this season. This is certainly going to help this week in a matchup against Denver, but more specifically, Pat Surtain coming up. Jaquan McMillan has spent the most time in the slot for the Broncos. He's only given up 28 yards, but he's only seen 4 targets this year, so nothing to be worried about there. And then finally, Chris Olave, who is one of my favorite buy low candidates for fantasy football. Excited to watch this matchup against Philly, which is not something I thought I would say at the beginning of the year. But I think we finally see him more involved in a game that Derek Carr should have to throw more than 20 times, which has not been the case for the first 2 weeks. Despite the additions that Philly made on their defense, it just hasn't worked out yet. They are tied for 6.9 yards per play allowed, which is the most in the league just across the board. They're giving up 7.2 net yards per attempt. That is the 5th most, and they're allowing the 2nd most fantasy points per game. Some of that is a little bit fluky and a little bit blown out of proportion, I think, just because of the Jaden Reed explosion in week 1. But the point remains that this is not a matchup to fade whatsoever. This game also has the 2nd highest total on the week with just a 2.5 point spread. So there should be plenty of fantasy goodness to go around.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add here with the wide receiver 1s. Let's move over to the wide receiver 2s, and they are Devonta Smith, Mike Evans, Tyreek Hill, Jameson Williams, DK Metcalf, Zay Flowers, DJ Moore, Malik Neighbors, Drake London, Rashid Shaheed, thanks for love to see, and Amari Cooper. Cody, what do you got on the wide receiver 2s?
Yeah, just want to throw Tyreek Hill out there real quick. We did see several games last year with Skylar Thompson at the helm. Even though Tyreek Hill had around a 30% target share, he still barely averaged over 11 fantasy points per game. So if you have him, it's hard to sit him, but you obviously have to completely lower your expectations. Tua was also placed on IR today, so we're not going to see him for at least 4 weeks. But moving on to some of the other guys I'm a little bit more excited about this week, Zay Flowers. He's actually tied with Amon-Ra St. Brown and Nico Collins with a 28% target share through the first 2 weeks. That is tied for the 13th highest mark among wide receivers. Flowers is by far and away the key piece of this passing offense. After his 21 targets, next is Isaiah Likely with 15. But we have to remember that 12 of those came in week 1 in that big game he had against KC. The total in this Ravens-Cowboys game is currently at 48.5. That is the 3rd highest total in the week. The spread is just 1.5 points. So both offenses should be able to move the ball. I don't think either team really puts this game out of reach either. And both offenses also have questionable running games as well outside of Lamar Jackson. So this is setting up to be another fun matchup for week 3. I already mentioned Chris Olave, but we got to talk about Rashid Shaheed here. Already mentioned the matchup, so we don't have to go over that stuff again. But Shaheed has been a wide receiver 1 in back-to-back weeks. This offense looks completely different from last year. Even if you take out the fact that they've scored over 90 points in the first 2 weeks, I think Clint Kubiak, just the offense in general, how it's set up, the way it's running, looks completely different. It's actually functional this year. Shaheed looks like an absolute steal at his ADP from just a few weeks ago. And if you have him, it's really hard not to jam him in your lineup, despite the fact that you probably drafted 3, 4, 5 wide receivers ahead of him. Next up, I want to talk about Stephon Diggs. Diggs only had 70 receiving yards for the first 2 weeks, but I think we see him more involved in week 3. Diggs has a 63% slot snap percentage, which is just 16% and 28% for Collins and Dell, respectively. This is important because whoever is lined up in the slot is going to see a good amount of Byron Murphy, who has been targeted 9 times on the season, has given up 8 receptions and a league-leading 107 yards from the slot. The only worry here is, Dell potentially sliding in, like I mentioned, 28% from the slot for Dell, potentially stealing some of those looks. So I think Diggs is set up nicely as a back-end wide receiver 2 on the week.
Yeah, I just wanted to pile on here with the Rashid Shaheed take because he's just been phenomenal. I mean, he's 7th in yards per out run, 1st in yards per team pass attempt, and he's also top 15 in target separation as well. So, and the thing that I really like the most they're doing with this team this year is they're running it's like 60% play action. They're doing a ton of motion as well, something they didn't do with archaic style of Pete Carmichael, and so and they're actually getting manufactured touches to Rashid Shaheed, getting the ball in his hands. So those are things that you love to see for him. And so for me, he's a must play, I think, moving forward, like a top 36 wide receiver. I know he is much higher than that in fantasy points per game, but some things are going to level out, or Chris Olave is going to kind of take back over. It's kind of being the wide receiver 1, but still really encouraging 24% target share. And like I said, we really haven't seen this team be pushed at all, have to do anything in the second half of the game. So I think the one thing you love to see more than anything is more so that it is a very consolidated target share right now. It's basically him and Chris Olave, and then after that, it's Alvin Kamara. So it's like them 3.
Yep.
So those are things you love to see. So that being said, go over to the wide receiver 3s, and they are Jalen Waddle, George Pickens, Tank Dell, Xavier Worthy, Jackson Smith, and Jigba, Michael Pittman, Terry McLaurin, Deontay Johnson, Brian Thomas, Khalil Shakir, Calvin Ridley, and Demarcus Robinson wrapping up the top 36. So wide receiver 3s.
Yeah, man, let's lead it off with JSN. He had his coming out party this last week, going 12 for 117 on a whopping 16 targets that led the team last week. Next up was DK Metcalf with 14. But JSN, his 16 targets, that was good for a 37% target share. We're obviously not expecting a repeat of that whatsoever going up against the Tua-less Dolphins. But Miami slot corner has allowed the 6th most yards from the slot through 2 weeks. Obviously, there's a small sample size, but if we turn the clock back to the 2023 season, he also allowed the 18th most yards from the slot, including a 128.1 passer rating. So JSN is in a solid spot here. Obviously, the thing to worry about is if they just get ahead and then they just run the rock with Charbonnet or Walker if he is healthy. But other than that, I think you can feel pretty good about him as a wide receiver 3/flex play. Khalil Shakir, he's been the most consistent option for Josh Allen for the first 2 weeks. Caught all 8 of his targets for 96 yards and a score, which came in week 1. Gets a matchup against the Jags, who just gave up over 100 combined yards to Jerry Jeudy and Elijah Moore. They're allowing the 8th most half PPR points per game to the position. Shakir doesn't have a super high ceiling by any means, but he's someone you can plug in and get wide receiver type 2 numbers as long as he finds the end zone. On the other side of that, you can consider Brian Thomas Jr. as a boom bust wide receiver 3. The rookie has over 150 receiving yards on just 6 catches through the first 2 weeks. It's just hard to trust in this offense that just looks completely lost. So not a lot to inspire there. But if you're in a situation where you kind of need that boom bust option, Brian Thomas is definitely a solid option there. And then finally, with the Red Rifle taking over in Carolina, I'm cautiously optimistic about Deontay Johnson. I think Andy Dalton, at the very least, he's going to help be able to move the chains here. Someone like Deontay should benefit. It's not like Dalton's going to be out there slinging it, trying to push it down the field, throwing in tight windows. I think he's going to be pretty cautious here, as in terms of how and where he is throwing the ball. Deontay should be on the receiving end of enough targets to make him a viable wide receiver 3 going up against a Raiders offense that showed some signs of life against Baltimore last week. So I think that could low key be a decent fantasy spot for week 3.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. And a lot of people were invested in Deontay Johnson, thinking that he was going to be the man this year, and not has not been the case. But
No.
it's good to see that the Panthers, though, I don't know who made the decision, but for them to move on from Bryce Young and bench him like that, I think was the right thing to do because I have never seen a more uninspiring offense to watch than this team. I mean, it was
Yeah.
just dreadful. Now, hopefully, some of these other guys can be fantasy relevant. Other than that, in terms of guys that are going past the top 36, the one player that I wanted to mention was Darnell Mooney. We finally saw him break out last week against the Eagles, where he put up 17.6 fantasy points. But I think the stuff that you really love to see is one, he's running 100% of the route, so he's always on the field, and he's also seeing a 20% target share. Now, I know this Falcons offense, passing offense, looked really bad week one, bounced back in a pretty good way, especially in the second half of last week. It felt like Kirk Cousins started to get some of that confidence back, started feeling better about himself, about being able his ability to be able to throw. He ran just a tiny bit. And so I think those are positives. And so I do think Darnell Mooney is going to start to be somebody that we talk about that is going to be kind of like somebody as like a flex option. So, and honestly, I actually think as early as this week, you can look at them because they get a Sunday night matchup at home against the Chiefs. And I would be worried about Trent McDuffie being all over Drake London because last week Trent McDuffie covered Jamar Chase, and that's one of the reasons why he had such a poor game last week. And he held them to one catch and 4 yards. So he is a shutdown corner. And so if they decide to cut shadow coverage with Trent McDuffie on Drake London, that is something I would be concerned about. And that's where I think someone like Darnell Mooney could really get involved here. So Darnell Mooney is definitely somebody you can look to play as a flex option this week.
Just a couple more names to throw out here at the end. Obviously, we have a couple injury situations to pay attention to. Guys, I can think you can look at either on the waiver wire if you need to dig down this deep, or just as someone to stash. Jawan Jennings, we have Deebo Samuel out for a couple weeks. So I think you can look to him in that 49ers offense. We've seen him have some production in some spots, especially when some of these guys get banged up for the 49ers, which seems to happen every single year. So I think you can look to him. Obviously, the worry here is that they jump out to a big lead and they just grind Jordan Mason through the rest of that game. But then on the other side of that, the Rams are 7-point home dogs. So I think you can look to some guys like Demarcus Robinson, who I think is probably going to be like the de facto wide receiver one going forward. Or I think Jordan Whittington, for people in deeper leagues, I think you can look at him because I think he fits the mold better of someone like a Puka or a Cooper Kupp. Obviously, not comparing him in terms of the talent level, but just his body type, the way that he's going to be utilized. I think Jordan Whittington makes some sense. The other injury situation I'm going to be looking at is going to be the Bears. If Keenan Allen is out, I think you could potentially look at someone like Roma Dunze going up in this matchup against the Colts. Not worried about that defense at all. DeForest Buckner just hit IR as well, which should help that offensive line out with not having to deal with him, which could give Caleb Williams some time. So he's someone to pay attention to. And then on the other side of that, Alec Pierce. Apparently, he's going to be the only pass catcher with a pulse in this receiving offense. Michael Pittman, super hard to trust. I have him outside of my top 36 wide receivers for this week. Alec Pierce, though, 10 targets over the past 2 weeks, has been a wide receiver 2 or better through the first 2 weeks. So, again, another boom bust option, hard to trust here. Even on the week where he popped off and was a wide receiver 1, Anthony Richardson completed 9 passes. So a little hard to trust, definitely more of a boom bust type guy. But like I said, he seems to be the only one with a pulse here. So if you have to, I think you can look at him, even though it feels a little point chasing. That is going to wrap it up. Appreciate you for rocking with us. Hit us with a like and a sub. We will be going live on Wednesday night to answer your start sit questions. You can drop questions in the comments, and we'll also be live on Sunday morning as well, going over all the information that we know throughout the week. Thank you guys for rocking with us, and we will talk to you soon.